So let's talk about the DSM-5. One thing they have started to do is take gambling, which was pathological gambling, which was originally in this kind of no man's land of the impulse control disorders, not otherwise specified or categorized. So it was with like kleptomania, it was with pyromania, it was with trichotillomania. They finally took it out and realized, well, this is some form of addiction, isn't it? And they put it into the addictive disorders, which is a good move because it's now recognizing that gambling, a behavior which has nothing to do necessarily with substances, falls very similarly with the same conditions of substance use. And this might start to lead other people to start to realize there's other behaviors similar to gambling, very similar, such as the video gaming, the internet use, sexual behaviors, shopping behaviors, that might also start to be recognized as addictive in potential. So that's one great thing. One thing to remember too about the DSM-5 and all the DSM categories, they always say this: it's a heterogeneous group of disorders, meaning one person's gambling behaviors is not the same as another person's gambling behaviors. Just like someone who has depression doesn't mean it's exactly the same as another person's depression. So there's lots of variation still there too. And even in the gambling literature, we know not everybody gambles for the same reason or gets into problems with gambling for the same reasons. Some it's because of psychogenic needs, ADHD, impulsivity, compulsivity, personality issues, and so on. So remember to take everything with a grain of salt and use these things as guidelines. Now, in terms of video gaming and the internet in terms of addiction, it has not yet been put into the official recognized categories in DSM-5, but it's been put in the back of conditions of interest, meaning perhaps at some time in the future it might be recognized. So again, but as a clinician, you're going to say, that's very interesting, but there's a person in front of me who says they have an internet issue and it's ruining their lives. So regardless of the DSM-5, and we'll go into this in other parts of these video segments, you're still going to need to deal with it. So regardless of DSM-5, remember you're a clinician. The DSM-5 is part of your guide. So some people ask, is internet addiction a primary issue or a secondary issue based on underlying issues? But I'll take it a step back and say, before we even go into calling it an addiction, to remember that people are quite complex and their behaviors are driven by many different motivations and factors. So I always ask, when we say internet addiction, for example, what are we talking about? Because the internet behaviors comprise many different things. Is it social surfing? Is it gambling online? Is it pornography? Is it shopping? There's so many different things there. What are we really talking about? We do know that the medium of the internet allows people to access many different things. It might act as a catalyst for underlying behaviors, such as if I have a gambling problem, the internet makes it a lot easier in certain ways for me to access it versus having to go all the way to a casino. So am I talking about gambling problem or an internet problem or both? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Just as if people want to talk about addiction, is it an addiction in the sense of it feels like it's out of control, I get withdrawal symptoms, I need tolerance, so I don't need tolerance, I will build tolerance, such as looking at this particular activity on the net, such as pornography, and eventually I want live pornography. I want to pay more money. I want to do more things. And now I'm going to go out into the real world to see someone in the sex trade. Is this what we're really talking about? Again, then is it a sex problem, an internet problem, and so on? Or perhaps, let's say, someone with ASD, otherwise known as autistic spectrum disorder, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a while. Is it just that that's their fixation and they use the internet to look over some of the things they're very interested in? Or they have social anxiety and they're avoiding everything, using the internet to interact with people. Is this an addiction or is it a coping strategy tying into some of their underlying conditions? But if we take a step back, and I hold myself back from saying underlying conditions sometimes, is, for all of you who have done the concurrent disorders training, we don't call it primary and secondary a lot of time. They're all equally important, meaning the social anxiety, let's say, for example, has now driven someone to actually develop internet behavior problems? Is this now the primary or surface thing and this is the underlying? Or they're both problematic? Just because I might be able to now help the person with the social anxiety doesn't mean the internet issues are suddenly going to vanish. I have to deal with both simultaneously. And we'll talk more about that approach. So some people make this interesting distinction between substance addiction and behavioral addiction. And what we seem to be finding is there's more in common with both than there are differences. For example, the reward pathway systems amongst all of these are implicated in similar ways. There are nuances across all these different activities. But let's go to substances for a second. Half the time, if not more than the time, I always hear about people talking about the rituals around the substance before they even use it. For example, people with cocaine issues. They're getting high or intoxicated in some ways just thinking about it. Dopamine starts to release because it's now their behavior. They know what to expect. Even getting their paraphernalia, going certain places, it's all part of a ritual. And that ritual is like a behavior that we're talking about here, whether it's internet, gambling, pornography, sex use, shopping. The whole substance use activity requires behaviors as well. We also know that people who take substances don't all react the same way because they're individual characteristics in the environment around them. So we do know, for example, sticking with cocaine, it can make people high, and so can, let's go with cannabis. So if one person smokes a one paper joint if you're wondering, certain people don't get affected by it at all. They go, I don't get it. I don't know what it's all about. Another person might smoke it and they go, yeah, I'm feeling kind of happy, mellow. Another person smokes it and goes, wow, I'm feeling very anxious and kind of jittery. Another person smokes it, gets a little bit paranoid, starts looking around. Another person starts smoking it and, starts hearing voices. The marijuana is always the same substance. It has specific things it will do to most people, but the individual characteristics, vulnerabilities, and genetic factors and all that is quite important. Also, the mood you're in when you take the substance. All these different things are important. And so substance use and developing problems are often dependent on these biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual factors as a complexity of the human being. So now we go into the behavioral addictions. Like, well, we're not putting substance in, so what's the problem here? But the same genetic factors, influences, environment, and so on are going to affect people. So someone who goes to gamble for the first time may or may not fall into problematic use. It gets back to how often are you exposed to these things, what mood you're in, what might happen, and so on. And thanks to the internet, where all sorts of cloaked gaming and gambling activities are there, it's much more ubiquitous that people with vulnerabilities might get into that problematic behavior. Back to substance use, just to go back to that, why do people use cannabis more than alcohol under 18? Because it's easier to get. It's more ubiquitous. Once you're older and you can actually get alcohol, it goes up higher than cannabis in terms of use because it's easier to get then, less legal issues and all that sort of stuff. With the internet, where it's all over the place, that's the easiest medium and form for people constantly bombarded who have vulnerabilities, that we are noticing these sorts of shifts. That, at least in our clinic, the people who are getting internet issues don't usually use a lot of substances, but the substances they do use, there's a bit of overlap here, are to help them keep with the game. So they might be using cannabis to keep themselves calm and in this timeless kind of feeling, or they're using stimulants to keep up with different things, and they use different sorts of drugs to knock themselves out when they want to sleep. But it's quite the overlap. So for those who think there's a huge difference between substance addictions and behavioral addictions, I would say you should rethink that. This is why they took the impulse control disorders category, looked and said, oh, gambling, and put it into addictions, because they're starting to realize this is way more similar than different than just saying substance use problems and these behavioral problems. That's the trend. We're moving that way. How can using substances which release certain chemicals in the brain be so similar in any way to shopping or playing a video game? You have to remember that the chemicals and substances that you put into your body, what they do is actually release chemicals in your brain, such as dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, all these things that affect your mood and your feelings and your thinking processes in certain ways. So that's how that works. What people don't realize is people who are getting excited about shopping or playing a game are releasing chemicals the same way. And depending on your vulnerability factors, it can become just as powerful as using a substance, in the sense that the same sort of techniques of the chemical side are there. The other thing too about with substances, there's some psychological things, which is intermittent reinforcement. When can I get it? When can't I get it? Am I going to get the same feeling with this particular stuff from this dealer or not? And so on. So that is quite, I want to keep getting it. I want to get that high, or chasing a high. People in gambling chase as well, because they're trying to get that high from the first win they had, because they got the same kind of feeling, which is, wow, I feel so great. I just won a ton of money, and I want to get that feeling back again. Not necessarily the money, I want the feeling. So I'm going to do things. And remember, if I bet at this way, at this time, I remember it worked. I'm going to keep doing it till I get it again. I don't care about math. I don't care about these sorts of things. So besides just the chemical factors, there's the psychological factors. And a lot of the video games and shopping, advertisement, and so on are designed by psychologists who help build all the psychology techniques for casinos and other gambling places and so on to hook people, which is intermittent reinforcement, and helping promote magical thinking, feeling masterful, meeting psychogenic needs, selling lifestyles and promises to people for owning things, for example, or feeling love and all this. And so it's going to release the dopamine, it's going to release the norepinephrine and the serotonin in different ways. And people will find, well, you know, I need this behavior because it makes me feel solid and good. And just like with substances, over time you go, I just need this substance just to feel normal. You need to keep doing the behavior just to feel normal. Eventually you crash with substances because all your chemicals have been depleted after a while. Same thing with the behaviors. After a while, the chemicals get depleted as well. And as we were talking earlier, a lot of people with these conditions have concurrent mental health issues and other things, which also are affected by serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And so the similarities are very, very powerful, and that's why people can get hooked into behaviors just like substances.